So if you are new to this title, you should know that it enables STEM researchers to write effective papers for publication, as well as other research-related texts, such as doctorate thesis, technical report, or conference abstract. If you are familiar with the successful first edition, you might be wondering what's new about the second edition. So that's why today we are also joined by the author, Hilary Glasman-Deal, who will be presenting the title shortly. The event will be comprised of two parts, a book presentation followed by a Q&A session, so feel free to leave your questions in the chat box and we will get to them in the second part of the book launch. So without further ado, I will leave Hilary to start the presentation.
Thank you very much, Andrea, and welcome to everybody who has come today. It's a bit of a shame, of course, to be doing these things online. It's much more fun to be doing it live. We don't have canapes or wine or anything else, but what we do have is more people, and it means obviously that more people can join from around the world. So that definitely makes me very, very happy. One of the questions that Andrea asked me to think about in this presentation was why is it necessary to have a second edition? And I think the short answer really is that since I wrote the first edition in 2010, things have changed very dramatically. And I think equally importantly, not only have they changed, but they are continuing to change quite fast. Science research communication is a very, very fast moving platform and particularly science research writing. So I think that any update or any second edition that doesn't actually consider the fact that it's changing and that it will continue to change, in other words, future change as well as current situation, is really just an update. And it would be essentially quite static, if you like. It would just be a snapshot of what's happening now. And it would just have a very short shelf life, frankly. I just thought I had more responsibility than that. So the second edition definitely will represent the changes that have occurred over the last 10 years. But the aim is also to enable researchers to become future-proof, if you like, against the changes that are inevitably coming in science research writing. So just to look at what I mean by changes, what I think those changes are. There are lots of, first of all, what exactly has changed? Well, the volume of research being published has shifted dramatically in the last 10 years. When I started to think about the first edition, there were around 500,000 research articles being published every year. Now it's around 3 million, and it's rising, I believe, about 2% per year. I think that global research and development budgets now are around $2 trillion a year, which even I was shocked by that figure. I think also I read recently that in biomedicine alone, 2 papers per minute are pouring into the PubMed database. So what is happening here is that you're getting a combination of a lot more papers being written and a lot more money going into STEM research. And what is happening is that you need to publish your research quite quickly, because the longer you go through peer review and rewriting, essentially during that period, the paper itself can just become unpublishable because some other group somewhere else has leapfrogged over you and gone ahead of what you're doing. So the papers need to be written much faster, but they also need to be written in ways that make them easier to read faster. I think it takes the average is around 100 hours to produce, to actually write the paper. But somewhat embarrassingly, the average reading time has now dropped to around 30 minutes per paper. And what that tells us is that the readers want to get the information effortlessly, if you like. They want to get the information fast, and they don't want to have to work to find out what's going on in the paper. So the way the internet works with reading is that if we look back to when I wrote the first edition, at that time, essentially it was mainly print journals. People they had a carefully curated set of print journals that would just arrive on their desk once a month, and they would read those journals and not much else. So what that meant is that researchers were at that time really only looking at what they were already looking for. So what you had were kind of quite closed shop micro communities where there was a very, very high level of shared knowledge. Everybody in that community shared the same background information, and they shared, in a sense, they shared the same research directions and the same research goals. But that world has gone. And now research has become, as a result of the internet, much more interdisciplinary. There's a much more fluid and faster uptake of research content, and people are definitely reading in different ways. So you've got these two things happening. Writing has got to be faster, and it's got to produce the information in a much, much clearer way than before. People just don't invest that amount of time any longer in reading. And also people need to be able to write, to read quickly. So what's happening now is that essentially when you're writing for an unknown reader, that you actually don't know whether that reader is in your discipline, you don't know what their level of background information is, and it's extremely hard to gauge that and actually get it correct in a paper, especially given that when you're writing the paper inside your research group, the people that you're talking to every day share the same understanding as you have. So it's quite difficult. You feel that if you give too much background information to support the reader, it might look kind of patronizing or condescending to people who are really inside the discipline. On the other hand, if you don't give enough, you're going to lose potential interdisciplinary readers. And all of this is having an effect actually on the content and the structure of research papers that are being written. What exactly has changed? Well, titles have changed quite dramatically because researchers spend an inordinate amount of time just title scrolling on the internet. They throw their keywords in or their concept in, and they scroll through titles to find something that they want to read. So what has happened as a result of that is that titles themselves have become much richer, if you like. They've become more powerful than they were before. And people are now considering search engine optimization when they're writing a title. Will this title come up to the readers that I'm interested in? This has a huge impact because what we're seeing is that, for example, some disciplines, some journals are encouraging sentence titles that actually just state the main findings. Some other journals are, you can see that the achievement or the take-home message or the power of the study is embedded inside the title and the word that identifies the value of the study. So those are definite changes. Also, titles are really considering the potential of a reader outside the discipline. So they're kind of balancing the title and keywords bundle between people who are inside the discipline and those who might be attracted from outside. What this means is that, for example, if your study is on vaccine development and you've used machine learning techniques, if those two things are not in your title, then that very, very tasty cross-fertilization is not going to happen. And your paper will just sit there dustily on the internet shelf and it might lose half of its readership. It's also quite difficult to predict forward what's going to happen in the life of your research article. So you really don't know whether the thing that you're doing is going to be of interest to the World Health Organization or to Apple computers in the future. So people are really considering the life of the study and where it might lead, and those things are being considered inside the title. Another area I think that has changed quite significantly is the writing of abstracts. It used to be that you'd fill your word limit, and pretty much everything that was important in the text would be somehow inside that abstract. But now, because what comes up on the internet page, first of all, and what most people read after the title, if they read anything else, is the abstract. The abstract, therefore, has to be kind of a coherent, standalone document. And it's not all-inclusive. We're seeing much smaller abstracts that prioritize the main message of the text rather than try and include everything. Another area of difference is, well, it's what used to be called IMRAD, Introduction, Methods, Results, and Discussion, is that the methods used to be within the print version of the text. But now, in some cases, the method that you use, or the experimental section of your research, runs to like 150 pages. And what happens is that that gets shoved out into a link to supplementary materials. But of course, once it's out, if you're going to be able to understand the results, you need some methods dripped into that results section. So that's changing the content of the results section, is that once your methods has exited the text, you need to rethink what's going on in the results section, and you need to drip in methods occasionally to show how these results were obtained. So in a sense, the IMRAD, this IMRAD that we talk about, is loosening. It's becoming more flexible, but the language that is used inside research writing seems to be, by contrast, seems to be stiffening. It seems to be reducing almost to a kind of communication as code. This is probably because science has become more global, and there's a high level of respect among global readers for each other's ability to process information. Writers are definitely stepping back, and we can see this from the goal of elegant or beautiful English, which is not inclusive at all. In fact, I often think of George Orwell's famous statement that good writing should be like a pane of glass. You should be able to see straight through it to the reality it's trying to represent. And certainly we can see in science research writing, there's much less interest in being elegant, either in your sentence structure or in the language that you're using. A clear indicator of change and the speed of change is that we're seeing new components popping up all over the place in research writing. You might find, for example, that on the front page of the research article, you're now seeing something called significance, a panel of what the significance is as a shortcut. Or you might see a panel of highlights coming up on the front page underneath the abstract. We're even seeing strap lines coming up. Everything is changing. It's like the Wild West out there. Everything is in flux. And really, to be able to get this right in a book and to try and incorporate the concept of change, I just felt that I needed a slightly different approach in this book to help people to do it. So, just flip forward. I knew that we needed to update, but what you're seeing here is my very, very confused idea of how this happened. I started out thinking about painting by numbers as a tool, if you like, to help writing to develop. And painting by numbers is a way of producing recognizably similar things from a toolkit. I think that because it took me such a long time to update the book, and because I started working with much broader areas of research expertise, so not just non-native speakers who were starting their research career, but all the way up to native speakers who were using the book, surprisingly, and at the top of their research career, it dawned on me that if I could embed this process, then ideally, it would not only help to write papers, but if people could actually train themselves to do it, then it would work for any research text, whether it was a grant proposal, a thesis, a dissertation, a technical report, a review article. It should work for everything, because what it does, I know it's ambitious, but what I did was I took around 2,500 recently published, I would say successful, if you like, research articles. Successful because they've been published in high impact journals. So let's assume that is some identifier of success. And the high impact journals, in a sense, on that picture, represent Leonardo da Vinci, if you like. They represent a worthwhile target. And I broke those down to generate the models and the writing patterns and the language that you see in the book to create that toolkit. And the advantages of doing that, rather than trying to work out what writing is that you do have authentic and successful input. So in the book, all the texts are of that type. The big advantage, I think, is that instead of trying to say what people should or shouldn't do, it's very much rooted in reality. It's descriptive of what apparently works. And also it's selecting language that is common and accessible. So whereas, as I was saying, in the past, you might have writers using elegant language. They might say, I don't know, in a literature review that a particular researcher alludes to a theory. It's much more normal now to simply say they mention it or they refer to it. So what you've got is in the book is that you've got this kind of slightly more restricted set of language that is accessible to global readers. So it respects all language levels and all research levels. It's very, very inclusive. And what it means is that you can use the book from a low level and use it to build up and manipulate and change your writing as things go forward. And you will need to, because the strategy of reverse engineering does enable you to future-proof yourself, because once you learn how to do it, then you automatically keep up with the changes in research communication going forward. So that was the aim, that was the intention, that's how I hope it works. You can see that it wasn't an easy journey for me, because I began, as I think many of us did as practitioners in my field, teaching writing. But I think it's much more about, in STEM, rather than teaching writing as a whole, it's much more useful to be tackling writing strategically rather than trying to build it from building blocks. So reverse engineering is an evidence-based strategy. What it does is it doesn't work forwards to try and learn how to write. It actually works backwards, if you like, from well-written, successful texts. And what happens is that once you start to do that, you get this kind of nice flow between the writer, the text, and the reader. There's that they all start to join up together. In fact, when we work with students and researchers who are doing this, we can see that very quickly they start to read differently. So they're not only looking at what the information is, but they're starting to become aware of how information is delivered down into a text. So that's very encouraging, and it seems to be good evidence that the strategy is workable and it's easy to train yourself into. I think the reason for tackling rather than teaching is that researchers have a very, very small window of time. Even if they think it's a good thing to do, they have a very small window of time to improve either English language skills or research writing skills. It's frankly, even if they want to. And reverse engineering as a strategy absolutely respects this, because it only deals with what is relevant and what is necessary. It's very quick, it's very instrumental, and it helps produce the paper or the thesis much, much faster, because you're writing into an existing scaffold. It also validates the input that I would offer, and that certainly that I offer in the book. Because you're actually looking at what's happening in the real world, it reveals and also tracks all the language and language changes and grammar changes. So for example, one thing that we're definitely seeing is that the modal verbs like could, because they're so difficult to manipulate, and there's, I mean, you've got could meaning two things. Could means it's possible, and could means is able to. So you've got these two potential options, both of which exist in science research writing. And the grammar of could is hell, frankly. It doesn't appear in the negative, and it sort of starts messing you around in the past tense. So what we're seeing actually is that science research writing is circumventing this. Instead of writing it could, it's being replaced by it's possible or it is able to. And these are nice changes, but reverse engineering texts constantly means that you can see these changes happening, and you can then, as I did, you can then start putting that into the book. It also validates my executive decisions about treating tense as in the book as a function rather than as grammar. So for example, you would see in the book that there's a huge difference between saying that you found that something occurred if you're describing your results. We found that this occurred, and we found that this occurs. They're both grammatically correct. They both, in a sense, reflect the same event. But if you say that it occurred, you're just reporting your research. If you say that it occurs, you found that it occurs, you're actually suggesting to the reader that this is a permanent and powerful truth. So you're putting more power behind it in terms of the function of the sentence, just by dancing with the text a little bit and dancing with the verb tense. So we can see that these things are, that the reverse engineering is a very, very powerful input into what's in the book. The truth is that the only way, of course, to be sure that you're on firm ground is by constantly reverse engineering current successful writing. In my case, and at Imperial, for a very, very demanding clientele, that this does keep you on your toes. Okay, nowhere to hide with this. So I guess an obvious question, given that there are other writing books out there, is what is the difference between this and other books? There are many, many very good books. Some are written from a theoretical perspective, some are written as style guides, some come from an applied linguistics perspective, and each of them makes an enormous contribution to this academic writing puzzle. Okay, they contribute a valuable piece of the puzzle, but they each come from a different perspective, and that perspective does affect the practical utility. It's a lens through which the writer is writing, but if it is stylistic, it tends to restrict itself to style. If it is theoretical, it tends to restrict itself to theory. Also, the target readership of, because the STEM is such a niche and it's such a small area of writing, the target readership of many books on writing is much more inclusive, which is great. But what that means is that the texts they use as examples and the illustrative examples and the tasks that are in the book are often, they may include education, humanities, but I would say that STEM writing is almost a law unto itself, in the same way that writing in law is a specific type of writing. I think STEM is as well. Also, many of these books have a fairly wide remit. You'll find that they would cover bibliometrics, editorial processes, copyright issues. Science research writing 2, the second edition, is really only focusing on what is absolutely relevant to this process of translating STEM research activity from the lab, or actually in many cases from the computer screen, onto paper, into the journal. So that there's a very narrow focus here, which I'm aware does restrict the readership, but I think it improves the practical utility. Another thing to mention is that, of course, some of these books have as their target readers native speakers, which of course STEM is much more global. And what that means is that some of them are written in quite elegant, erudite language. Okay, I'm not an academic, I'm a practitioner, and there's no risk of me being too elegant. I think another difference is that many of the books out there are focusing on the writer. But the focus in science research writing too is equally, and perhaps even more, on the needs of the reader as the writer. It's quite surprising that always to me is that when we're working at Imperial with researchers and we're in consultations or in workshops, it sometimes comes as a shock to the people we're working with that they need to consider the needs of the reader. And they say, never thought about this before. It's as though they're writing with a mirror in front of them, and their primary aim is just to get the information down, get the science down on the page. But the problem here is that the writer always understands what they've written. They never have difficulty because they wrote it. And they don't even realize that the reader probably doesn't remember earlier parts of the text, certainly if it's a long text. And that's even if they read the earlier parts, which of course in many cases they didn't. So what we're trying to do here is enable the writers to understand how to link information explicitly and patiently, and to do it via a narrative that enables the reader to see the direction of travel, to see where this information is going, to see why it's there, so that the reader is not thinking at the end of each sentence, so what? Why are you telling me this? The information itself is neutral. It has no function at all until or unless the writer tells the reader what that function is and shares the direction that they're moving in, comments on the information. So again, we're seeing a lot of that in the text. I think another issue here is that prescriptive advice is sometimes quite general and a little bit bland. So things like write clearly and coherently, it doesn't really help. Sometimes the advice is actually untrue. I mean, I've seen in journal guidelines things like don't include the implications of your study in the results section. People are told that the results section is for what the results are, and the discussion section is for what the results mean. But it's simply not true. If you look in the real world, if you look at these high impact journals, there is always information in the results section that shows potential implications. We found this suggesting that, this may mean that. And these things are definitely explored in greater depth in the discussion section, but the advice that's being given by the journal just doesn't fit what's actually happening sometimes in that journal. I think that what we would be saying is that it's not enough for the writer to make it possible for the reader to understand. The job of the writer is actually to make it impossible for the reader not to understand. And that requires a little bit more comment, a little bit more narrative, a little bit more empathy beyond just what the content of the science is. Another disadvantage of publishing prescriptive guidance in a book is that even if it's really, really good, it's a book and it risks becoming outdated, but it just lingers on for years because things change, and particularly they change in science writing. So the difference here, I would say, is that science research writing 2 is descriptive, like research writing 1. It's very firmly rooted in reality. It focuses only on STEM texts and STEM examples. And it doesn't just reflect current writing norms and conventions, but also provides this reverse engineering tool to change these things as they develop. At the Centre for Academic English at Imperial College, we really are at the coalface. We work every day with research writers. We're teaching them, we're training them, we're consulting with them. We're working with non-native speakers who are struggling with the language, and native speaker professors who are absolutely the highest of high flyers. And they just want to write better or faster. And what that means is that everything I do, everything we do, everything that has gone into the book has been road tested in terms of its effectiveness. I hope that there's nothing in there that doesn't deliver. So, science research writing would respond to something like, can I include acronyms in the title? Or what tense should I use in the conclusions? Or how much background information should there be in my introduction? Or can I include citations in the abstract? All of these frequently asked questions, and those are definitely questions taken from the book in those sections. All of the answers are coming from real published research rather than from a theoretical or a stylistic point of view. Hopefully, it's bias-free. Hopefully, it's perspective-free. That's my aim. So, looking really at what the problem is that being told what to do is not the same thing. Even if you're told it very clearly, it's not the same thing as being told how to do it. There's an enormous amount of advice out there. Some of it is conflicting. But if you want to know how to write a title and you're told be brief, well, first of all, the titles in the journal that you're wanting to submit to, they may not be brief. They may be really, really, really long. So you need to be looking at the average number of words in the titles in the book, in the journals you want to submit to. Keyword, word numbers actually very, very useful, because what you see sometimes in the title is that because people want to get it high up in search engine optimization, they dump everything, every keyword into the title. And what you get is a title that is unreadable, that doesn't mean anything because it's just a collection of keywords and the grammar doesn't hold together in any way. You shouldn't have to read the title twice to work out what it's about. So if you're thinking about how to RE, meaning reverse engineer a title, have you done your Google Scholar check? Have you checked whether other people include acronyms, and particularly what acronyms are acceptable in your field? Is it going to be a micro community text where you can really go to town on your acronyms, or is it one with an interdisciplinary readership where you just can't? We see that some journals are very keen on these sentence titles. It's interesting that once you start doing this, one of the things that we notice working with researchers is that the study begins as an investigation into something, and that becomes kind of a working title. You see the title at the end is an investigation into, and actually that's really the topic. It's the research activity. It's not the title of the text. So again, looking at titles and seeing that most of them don't begin an investigation into, they might begin with an offer, an A or AN offer. So a method for, a device for, that's an offer one beginning with A or AN. But they're very unlikely to be an investigation into, but it doesn't really tell you what you're going to buy with this text. Happy words, we're seeing, and there's a lot of research about this, but we are definitely seeing that identifiers of precisely what is the value of this piece of this study is starting to come into the title. So words like accurate, I would say, is a happy word. So it shows you what you're going to get. It shows you the value of the study. Sometimes you see the applications, a device for this in this, a device for accurately measuring this in that. Simple metrics are very useful all round. They will tell you, for example, if you're thinking about, if you've written your introduction and it seems very short or very long, count the number of words in your target journal. See how many words are in normal introductions. It gives you a baseline. Are you a long way from that baseline? For example, when you're writing the discussion section. Count the number of mapping citations, the citations that anchor your study, anchor each study in relation to the existing knowledge. How many of those are there? Are you expected to be anchoring your study and positioning it at to approximately the same extent? Metrics are useful, and research engineering forces you into a much cooler metric-related way of writing. The number of words in a paragraph even is a very, very powerful metric. I once spent a boring Sunday, long before you could do this using software, just averaging out the number of words across a range of journals. It was 153. But what that tells you, it tells you something about the function of paragraphs. It tells you that if you're writing single sentence paragraphs over and over, you're actually not writing the way everybody else does. So this reverse engineering approach keeps you locked onto what is currently there. And that's the backbone, if you like, that's what's underneath the everything in the book. So, let's see if I can get this to go forward, because I've now moved a picture of myself. There we go. So, thinking about how the book actually works, what do you get when you open it up? What are you going to see? Well, similar in one sense to the first book, in that what you actually get is from, let's say that you're thinking about writing the introduction or the discussion section or the methods, whatever it is, you will get a boiled down generic model for, let's say, for the discussion section that shows you what the components are, what type of things to expect, what type of things tend to occur early in the discussion section, and what type of things tend to occur towards the end, so that you can fit what you're doing into an acceptable conventional framework. The advantage of doing it the same way that everybody else does is that when somebody reads it, it's easier for them to recognize what is going on if it fits those kinds of conventional norms. So although you might not want to write exactly according to the model, it still gives you a place to hang your hat. It gives you something to deviate from. So if what you're thinking is, how the hell do I begin the discussion section? Well, you've got options in the model for beginning it. If you still can't think of what type of things should be included, they're all listed. If you don't quite know how to end it, you can see what things are occurring towards the end. So there's your robust text model for each segment. And then side by side, you have component number 2, which is the writing strategies and the grammar that you might need. So for example, how to translate modal verbs out of could into it's possible to. And then the third component is a corpus, if you like. It's a list collected of language for each function in that model. There's a list of language to make that function happen. So for example, let's say that you're writing the discussion section. There's a task to help you to reverse engineer some discussions and come up with a model. You then compare it to the model that is in the book. And the model is essentially, of course, updatable. And there's a bunch of Q&As attached to that model. So for example, how do I state the limitations of my work without looking like a failure? Okay, and that attaches to a list of language. So everything you might want to know is attached to language as well. There's also a grammar, the grammar and writing skills. So for example, what verb tense should I use when I'm talking about the implications of my study? Examples and answers to that. There are language lists. If you're thinking about how to identify the value of your work, well, there are language lists that show words like it's cost effective or it's straightforward, so that the reader isn't left in doubt, wondering what the value, what the achievement of this text is. Essentially, once you've got the model and you've understood the writing skills and you've got the language lists, you should be able to just put the three together with your research on top, and it should almost come out like a sausage machine. It should come out almost automatically. And I have had people who have just used the model, the writing skills and the language, and kind of done it without too much thinking. I'm not sure that I would advise that, but in theory, it's possible. So actually, I was particularly delighted. There was one Amazon review of the first edition, which translated from the German. The review said, I've just got it here, you can use it immediately. No long reading time necessary. Just lock and load, ready to use, and off you go. I don't think it's quite as simple as that, but I think it's possible. And I also think it gives you confidence to know what's normal and to know the language that's normal and to know the structures that are normal, mean that once you get more confidence and once you become more expert, of course you manipulate it and you build on it, but at least it gives you a starting point. So, what's new in the second edition? Well, certainly all the extracts and the examples are all new, of course. And the FAQs that attach to the model and attach to the to everywhere in the book have all been upgraded to reflect two things: to reflect what's current, and also to reflect the questions that I've been asked over the years. So, as one of the aims was to increase the writer's independence and confidence via reverse engineering. So there are tasks in the book as well that try and gently shift this reverse engineering activity over from me to the reader of the book, who will eventually become the writer. With the aim is that they will take that forward and be able to use it forever. In a sense, it's kind of like creating a hardware that then the writer will be constantly updating it with new software. What is very encouraging is that it seems to be quite easy to do. In fact, it seems to be embarrassingly easy to do. Is that once you've understood how to do it, not only do people pick it up and start doing it, but what is much more interesting is that they start to read differently, is that they are no longer just reading for content, but somewhere they're also becoming aware of how that content is being delivered. Another big difference in the second edition is that there's a real focus on the narrative around the information and the narrative around the content. It's absolutely, I was going to say shocking. It's true that very, very high impact, high level journals publish research articles that are grammatically very dodgy indeed. And so they should, because there is this need for speed, because there is this desire to get your research out. But they do reject papers on the grounds that they lack narrative flow. And I hear this from editors. It's hard for the writer, as I said before, to even understand why you need a narrative. This is kind of belief that your results just speak for themselves. But actually, if they did just speak for themselves, all you would need would be a series of graphs or tables or bar charts in the results section. You wouldn't need any writing at all. So clearly they don't. Clearly there is a need for communication and narrative with the reader. The fact is, if there's no narrative, all you have is a collection of sentences. You don't have a text. So the book aims to train writers to actually shake out the science content. This is in Julie King's words, Julie King from the Centre of Academic English at Imperial. Shake out the science and take a look at what's left. Take a look at how, what's left, what's the net holding the science, and that net is what is communicating with the reader. So that reveals this narrative wrap around the information. And it helps the writer to see how that actually anchors the content and drives the text forwards as well as responding to the needs of the reader, who, as we said, is the most important person in this interaction. There's also now a new full chapter on conclusions. I mean, the fact is that in this fast reading, information surfing world, a lot of researchers will just be going from title to conclusions. They may not even read the interim part unless they need it for some reason. So there's a chapter on conclusions. There's a full chapter on titles. There's a new checklist and tips chapter. The detail is in the book. This is just a sort of a quick reference hit. How am I doing for time? Oh my goodness. Okay. That's pretty much all I wanted to say. So the message really is that perfect English skills will not compensate for defective or poor writing, but good writing can definitely compensate for imperfect language skills. So the first change, just to sum up, the first change is this explicit inclusion of reverse engineering as a strategy. Second big change is the title of the book, and therefore the readership, because I found in the past 10 years that as many native speakers were using the book as non-native speakers. So really they have the same challenges, and it seems to be common at all research levels. Writing is time consuming and it's hard for me as well. And being a gifted researcher does not mean that you are a gifted communicator. It's tough. And because of the complexity of most STEM research, creating effective text requires quite a high level of communicative competence. So my hope is that the second edition will train writers to use reverse engineering. It'll be useful to everybody. Non-native speaker, early stage, native speaker, late stage. And it'll also be useful to other practitioners like me, and that we all continue to learn from each other. Thank you very much. That's it.
Thank you very much, Hilary.
Sure.
We can now move to the Q&A session. So as I mentioned earlier, please do leave your questions in the chat box. Just to kickstart this, we do have a couple of questions ready. So the first one, so I imagine a lot of people when they read the book or hear about it, they assume you must have a science background in order to write this book. Do you have a science background, or is that important?
I have absolutely no science background whatsoever. Not only am I not convinced that it's important, I actually think it would make matters worse. I think that if you can't understand the science, you've no temptation to put your fingers into it. But what you can see is whether there's comment or narrative or congruence, or whether there's similarity between the text you're looking at and the text the writer is trying to produce. It's also, I think, that if you do understand the content, you sometimes confuse the fact that you understand it with the fact that it's well written. So that's another problem. So if I was reading a text in the humanities, it would be quite difficult for me to know whether the text worked as a text if I found the subject matter interesting. I think there's also an issue of ownership, is that if you're advising or supporting somebody who's writing a text on philosophy, I would find myself saying things like, maybe you mean this. And then I'm not quite sure afterwards who really owns that text, who really is the author. So I think it's much easier to do it when you don't have science knowledge. And actually, nobody could have that level of science knowledge in every field. You can't have astrophysics and biomedicine and machine learning at that level. In any case, it's just not going to happen. So that's my answer.
Thank you. Margaret is asking, how does the current book take into account theoretical STEM papers?
Theoretical STEM papers?
Yes.
You mean, for example, things like maths rather than practical work? It doesn't really make a difference what it is, because what you're looking at is always you're looking at a set of comparable papers on similar topics. So it doesn't, the content of that paper, whether it's theoretical or practical, shouldn't make any difference at all. You're looking for the same things. You're looking to see what the models are for that type of paper and how yours is similar or different. So normally we'd look at, if I was working with somebody on a very highly theoretical paper, I would simply take a look at 10 comparable current papers, try and set up my models and my language and what's normal, how it works, and then see the similarities and differences between that and the paper that I'm being asked to consult on. So it shouldn't really, once you've learned how to do that reverse engineering, shouldn't make any difference whether it's theoretical or practical. Does that answer the question? I hope.
How do you think interdisciplinarity will affect STEM writing in the future?
Sorry, Andrea, I did not catch that. How do I think?
How do you think interdisciplinarity will affect STEM writing in the future?
Well, frankly, it's affecting STEM writing dramatically now, not just in the future. And because, as I said, because of the way the internet and the access to information is working, it's had an enormous impact on STEM writing. I think that the concept of a sort of a closed shop micro community is in any case breaking down. Scientists are extremely portable and their projects are portable, and there's so much exposure to each other and to different research groups. I think people are looking for interdisciplinary relationships. I mean, certainly when you look at design engineering, there you go. I mean, even the two words express the interdisciplinarity. Biomedicine, the two words immediately express the fact that these disciplines are joining up. It's quite unusual, comparatively unusual, to see single disciplines just going along train tracks. It is affecting things. People are needing to consider access from non-experts and what that means for the content of the paper already, and it's being reflected everywhere in STEM writing. So it's already happening.
Thank you. Do you see the book as something students should tackle on their own?
I think it can, yeah, I think it can just work on your own. I think it's nice to be doing it with a tutor. And I know that there are courses where it's a course book. So in that sense, what you'd have the opportunity to produce writing, which of course the book doesn't enable you to do, to produce writing and see if it fits or doesn't fit. So working entirely on your own is definitely going to be tougher because you won't really get a response about whether you're succeeding or not. But most people that I think in the book, the original, the first edition sold, I think, around 50,000 copies. Those were not all people who were working with a tutor. So definitely it can be used without anybody else. It seems, I mean, I hope it's self-explanatory, but you're right, you don't get the opportunity to write and get feedback unless you're working with a teacher.
Thank you. Yeah. So someone is asking if the book is available. Yes, the book is already available, so it can be purchased. And we will, so this meeting is recorded, so you'll be able to watch it again on our YouTube channel later. So someone else is asking, how much is incorporating multimodality, for example, graphs or equations with text included in the book?
Well, look, I mean, certainly in the chapter on abstracts, there's a fairly large segment on graphical abstracts, but that's a very interesting question because, of course, there is a relationship between the legend underneath a figure and the content of the language that surrounds that figure. There's not. That's an interesting point, isn't it? There's not an enormous amount of, and certainly that relationship is a very, very complex relationship between what you actually write underneath the figure and how that appears in the text. But I think that there's quite a lot in the sense of language that's used to comment on figures. There's an enormous amount of language that can be used to comment and present figures. I mean, even the how to juggle the verb tense between presenting a diagram of a piece of equipment that you've built and one that you used in, and one that you used in your work. So there is a fair amount of that. Maybe not enough. Maybe that's another paper. If I ever feel like writing anything else. But there is certainly a lot of the language that you can use to describe figures and the language you can use to present figures inside the body of the text. There's a lot of that.
Thank you. Someone is asking about the reverse engineering approach. So because a lot of the literature that is published these days is not particularly well written, how do you get authors to push for a higher standard rather than just mimic published mediocrity?
This is very tough, and there are certainly, very often when we're working with students, we say, well, can you find 4 or 5 high-level articles that you think are well written in your field that we can use to extract, we can use as reverse engineering models to work from. And in some cases, it's just impossible to find 4 that are well written. So this is definitely an issue. You don't want to be imitating something that is poorly written or in bad English. What we tend to suggest at the moment is that you head for the high impact journals and head for the big names rather than the smaller journals as your models. There's no way you can avoid the fact that people, certainly native speakers, do not always write well. They really don't. And an acid test is if you've got to read a paragraph over and over again before you understand it, that one is not written well. So this is a problem, of course, is that your input is usually very, very varied. It's very jagged picture. If you can find articles that have been written by people who are well known, or that the article has been highly cited, or that it comes from a native speaker, an institution in a native speaker country, so Australia, New Zealand, the UK, Canada, the USA, you've probably had a little bit more editorial input on that than if it's come from a smaller journal or in another country. But one of the acid tests really, I think, is to check the phrases and concepts in Google Scholar and see whether people are writing that way. So whether these are normal ways of writing. So you can just put a chunk of it into Google Scholar and see, is this a normal way of writing? Is this the way that people are writing in my field? It's not easy, because it's absolutely true that you have a very varied level of writing competence among scientists and language competence. But perhaps that's where the book comes in, can step in to at least show you what might be a better way of doing it based on other journals, other articles. So the models and the language stand up on their own, irrespective of whether or not the one that you're looking at happens to be well written, let's say. But it's true, you don't want to be imitating poorly written articles, and it's really hard to work out what's well written and what isn't. So go for the high impact journals, try and look for ones that come from institutions that are either famous or in countries where English is the language of instruction. That would help.
Thank you. Should there be a consensus of writing style across the science community?
The difficulty with any kind of consensus is that it is static. I think that's really one of the points I would want to make, is that as soon as you try and fix it, you put your hand on it and the thing starts to move, because it is being there. There's this flood of information coming in at speed. Ultimately, it's much more about what works and what communicates well, rather than trying to get a consensus. In a sense, you've kind of got some kind of consensus going on in the background by default, in the sense that the language, the vocabulary is shrinking. It's getting to be a smaller and smaller set, which is kind of creating communication as code. So you're seeing the signals, the language becoming much more codified, and it's not a conscious decision. It's just this is what works. This is what is accessible to the global reader. This is what's normal. So whereas many years ago, you would have had this very, very wide language set and quite nuanced language, you kind of don't get that any longer. You've got a small set to work with, and it's almost encoding your research into it so that it can be decoded by anybody, anywhere. So you've got a consensus by default, in a sense. Okay.
Thank you. We've got a more sales-oriented question. So, hi Hilary, is the book best aimed at academics writing up research papers? Can it also be sold to postgraduates or even undergrads?
Yes, oh, that's a very interesting question. Certainly to postdocs, postgraduates, because it should work for any research document, even a technical report in industry. You should be able to use the same strategy of reverse engineering. It's interesting that you ask about undergraduates, because one of the things that we're doing at Imperial is that there's a process going on, definitely, I think, and this is probably across all of academia, where undergraduates are starting to have assignments that are almost like embryo papers, if you like, so that they're starting to join the academic community on a continuum rather than be identified as undergraduates and non-researchers at that stage. So we're seeing undergraduates starting to write basic research papers. So definitely that would work for undergraduates, but ultimately this reverse engineering approach should work for any document, provided there are comparable, well-written models to work from. It's harder when you've got something as big as a thesis or a dissertation, but the advantage of the book is that essentially a research article is a microcosm of a thesis or dissertation in any case. So you can use those models again. When you've got, I mean, it works for grant proposals. We were recently working on the research excellence framework at Imperial, and definitely it works for those kinds of significant statements, for research bids. So long as you've got some good examples to work back from, rather than try and think of how to write it from first principles, it will work, hopefully, for any kind of text. It's not rocket science. It's just, and I said it's embarrassingly simple. It's just learning to see what is in the text apart from the science and how it's being delivered to you. Not hard.
Thank you, Hilary. And one last question. A characteristic of the first edition was a list of phrases used for different rhetorical purposes. Is this repeated in the second edition? Why or why not?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes. Short answer. That was quick. It most definitely is. Yeah. And I know that was one of the key selling points of the first edition. Actually, what is happening there is that it's like the book is trying to create almost like a supermarket, where if you're working on the discussion, everything is sitting on the shelf there. You kind of pull down the model. You've got your language skills, and you've also, for each part of the model, you've got lists of words and phrases. So what it does is it kind of like keeps you moving forward. If you can't think of how to express something, well, pull it off the shelf. The list is there. If you want to identify in the introduction, if you want to work out the gap or challenge or difficulty with existing research in the introduction, you've got a list of words that you can pick one, whichever one it is. So it's kind of, you don't have to think. It should be all sitting there. Yes.
Thank you, Hilary. Unfortunately, this is all the time we have for questions today. World Scientific is happy to offer a 30% discount to this title in all formats. And in 1 second, I will share with you the discount code. So you can enjoy the science research writing for native and non-native speakers of English, the second edition, at a special price with a 30% off discount on our website, the World Scientific website, or you can scan the code you can see on the screen, which would lead you to the book page. Once you get to the book page, you can add it to the shopping bag, and then you can introduce the discount code WSSRW230 for 30% discount on this title, all formats, until the 21st of July 2021. Thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you, Hilary, for taking the time. We all know how busy you are, and I hope you all have a lovely rest of the day and a great rest of the week. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Goodbye.